Also because you could be harmed seriously in the streets, whereas like in the same way as
do you think of that?
Yeah. You have to, and especially if I'm not an Australian citizen. Like it had a very different implication because I could get deported.
Hello, welcome to this channel once again, and welcome to an episode with one of the happiest persons I've ever met. I mean, just look at her, always happy. You will never catch her frown. Let's see. I've never seen you frowning.
You put me on the spot. Now I can't frown.
But really, I've never seen you frowning. No, this is the happiest person you will ever meet. So, Srish, tell us about yourself. You're from India, and we're here in Chicago. So tell me about yourself. You growing up in India, where you've been to, because you've been to many places, and somewhere interesting. She's been to Australia. We'll talk about that. So let's start with that.
Yeah, so I was born in 2000 in India.
In the year 2000?
Yeah.
You know, that's when they said the world was going to end.
It's true. The world ended and then I was born.
Right?
No, I was born in this really small town, 2 hours away from the city of Kolkata, called Shamnagar. It's a tiny town. My parents grew up there. They went to school there. They met there. They fell in love there. Almost their entire lives basically is out of this one place. And I was born there.
Where is this place in Indian map? I mean...
So it's in the east. Kolkata is a city in the east. So it's a 2-hour drive from Kolkata. So it's like a small town outside.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a really quiet, like, small place. There's a big, like, coal broiler factory. It's closed now, but there used to be one. It's basically the state's electricity supply. It's where my grandfather worked. So kind of my entire family has lived their lives there. My mother's side are refugees from Bangladesh. So because they moved, because they were forced to move once, they really didn't want to move ever again. So they've kind of built their own whole lives there. My grandparents did pass away there as well. So my parents moved us to the city for me to go to a good school. Otherwise, like, Shamnagar now has good schools, but didn't in the 2000s. So they wanted me to go to like a nice English language school where the first language is English. Moved us to the city. I got into like a nice school in the south of Calcutta where we lived. And I went to school there.
Let me pause you there. Let's just wind back a little bit. Mm-hmm. You said you're from your mom's side, the family was refugees from Bangladesh.
Yeah, my mom's side.
Now, growing up, did that have any impact?
Yeah, of course. So native Bengalis or Ghotis don't really like the refugee side, which are Bangals. There's a lot of subtler forms of racism, of cultural xenophobia. So it impacted my parents, like their relationship with the in-laws, like as in my grandparents on both sides. Yeah. They got along because my mother is an only child. So they got along, but they didn't really like each other. There was a lot of argumentation. There was a lot of snide comments. They weren't super happy about my parents getting married because they also had a love marriage, and almost everybody else in the family has had arranged marriages. So it was a bit complicated like that.
Is a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing. It's still a thing, actually. But yeah, so they didn't. My father's parents didn't really want my mom and dad to get married, but they got around. My grandfather actually really liked my mom eventually, but they got around, and yeah, my parents went to school together, so it was very much for them, either each other.
Do you have any relationship with Bangladesh?
I do. I've been there a lot of times. I have family there.
Okay.
My only 2 cousins who are academics also live in Bangladesh. They are the Bangladeshi side of my family.
Okay.
Everyone on the Indian side of my family are like doctors or engineers. They have very traditional careers.
Is this a thing in the part of the country where your dad is from? I mean, are there some Bangladeshi relations?
Yeah. Like most Bengali children have at least one grandparent who's a refugee from Bangladesh. It's very common. Okay. It's an incredibly, most of my friends growing up were also like this combination of, it's called Bati actually. It's one side is Bangal, the other side is Ghoti, together Bati. Bati children are like a very common thing, actually. It's really common. So lots of us, there's a weird kind of denial. No one really talks about the refugee side of their families. No one really sees that as like a refugee experience. It is more like, oh, it was done. Like now we're all going to move on. It's very we don't really, because it's not a marginalization in the way, say, Palestinians have to think about it, right? It's it's no longer happening right now. Actually, it is happening. It's just people can't see it. There is still a lot of border violence between India, Bangladesh, or India, Pakistan. We don't really just talk about them. It's more like it was done and we got to move on. The grandparents really never talked about it. The parents were encouraged to never bring it up. It's supposed to be like a shame thing. My parents didn't do that. So when I was 10, 11 years old, we went back to where my grandfather is from. We reconnected with a bunch of family.
Oh, okay.
And those are my family members who are academics as well. Both of them are social science researchers like me. So I really get along with that side of my family. I get along with those cousins much better than I get along with the cousins I get to see more often because I have more in common with them.
So how many years did you live in India before you decided to move?
Oh, 18. Like I finished high school.
And why did you move?
I think in India, the school system is very based on rote learning. You have to mug up a bunch of stuff that you've been assigned, and then you have to kind of memorize it, and then you have to throw it out in your exams, and you don't, there's no concept of open book, really. So it's more a retention and memory test as opposed to, an academic test. You're not really being tested on your ability to write well, or to, innovate, or create research, or solve a problem.
About cramming and telling us.
Yeah, you're basically cramming, and then you're it's a memory and retention test. It's not an academic test in the sense you're not solving a problem. You're not, And I didn't find there to be any sense in that from a humanities perspective, particularly. I'm sure science students have a similar problem. In fact, my partner, who's a science person, also chose to move away for college. But I don't really understand that side of the thing. But with humanities, it made no sense to me that things that were concerning real-world problems happening in real time to real people were being based on memory and retention. How is it connected? It's not relevant at all. In fact, I would rather study about memory.
But maybe how about that's what you need at that age?
I don't think that's true because, maybe some ways. There are some things you do need to memorize. But also, I feel one, it's very unfriendly to different access needs. It prioritizes a very specific kind of ability. And I was good at it too. I had to be good at it, and I was.
I agree with you on that.
But it's not friendly to lots of different kinds of intelligence, lots of different kinds. And the thing is, if there was space for all of that, and then we still had to learn things, I would have been fine with it. But there was no space for any other kind of creativity. In fact, I was very harangued in school by a lot of my teachers for being a kid who was curious. I used to ask a lot of questions. I ended up becoming a researcher, so you can tell, asking questions really worked for me. I worked in the media for ages. You can tell, asking questions, pursuing a story, that's my thing, and that has worked for me in my career. But I was very encouraged to not do that when I was in school.
So I'm curious, at 18, were you conscious to know that this is not the kind of education you wanted?
I was conscious about it when I was 15. I wanted to get out as soon as I possibly could. And I didn't grow up very wealthy. My parents couldn't afford to send me to college outside. I actually wanted to come here for my undergraduate, but because this is a private school, they don't do scholarships for international students.
Okay.
So I chose to go to Australia because I got a scholarship. Basically, it's whatever was cheapest for me.
So when we were searching for, scouting for schools, how did Australia come to? Are there many Indians in Australia?
There are, but that's not what I was looking at because, again, those are usually science people. So one thing about Indians, there are a lot of Indians in Australia or in America, but they're mostly engineers. There's quite a bit of them in engineering, data science, machine learning, those sorts of fields. There's not a lot of Indians doing humanities researches. There are several in the university, but this is the first time I have met them down here. In Melbourne, I didn't see any. I was the only Indian in my critical theory reading group by far. I was also younger than everyone else. It was it was a different space. But the reason Australia was on my radar is because I was looking at places. I didn't want to go to the UK because I don't know why. I just I felt like it would be hard to convince my parents to let me move to the imperial motherland.
But there's so many Indians in the UK.
There are. I don't know. I didn't want to. I guess if I studied English Lit, I would have gone to the UK. I was not thinking of it because media, the kind of traditional scholarship in the media is from Britain. British TV is kind of the birth of media studies as a field. But I was more interested in sort of more cultural scholarship side of media, which is not very TV oriented. So I guess America or Australia was very on my radar, and then US would have been too expensive for me. Also, you're not allowed to work outside of campus in the US in your undergraduate. In Australia, so that was my big decision-making point, is that I could work 20 hours outside the campus, so I could have any job.
You still got a scholarship?
Yeah, and I got a pretty hefty scholarship. It was a 50% scholarship, and then I took a loan out for the rest because my parents can't afford this. And
so life in Australia,
I really enjoyed it.
This young person moved into a new country. How far from home was that?
Quite far. It's a 12-hour flight.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I don't know what it is in kilometers, but it is. like the thing that everyone knows about Australia is that it's literally just like too far from everything
It's too far from everything else and the animals and
you also need
the
4 hours
kangaroo.
you need 4 to 6 hours to just cross the country because like Australia is pretty massive actually. It's a really big place. So to go from Melbourne, which is in the east coast, to Perth, which is in the west coast, you have to catch a 4 or 5 hour flight.
That's crazy.
Which is like really far, even within the same country. I mean, that's the same in the US, but in the US they also have very different characters. No one really thinks about Perth and Melbourne as different places because to everyone it's just Australia, right? Like.
That's like, all we know. That's all we know.
Exactly. Whereas, like, you know New York and Seattle and Chicago all as different places in your head. You don't really think of Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne.
Well, America is still bigger, though.
Yeah, it's big, but it's, like, also characteristically different. Like, you know that Seattle and New York are different places.
Different people, different culture, too.
About Australia, you don't really know that Perth and Melbourne are significantly...
Yeah, culturally?
Yeah. Oh. Like, every city has its own character, like, the same way it's in any other place. I'm really glad I went to Melbourne. It really worked for me. Melbourne is a very art-oriented place. It's like the protest hub of the country. Like a lot of activism happens in Melbourne.
And you do activism.
So, I mean, art and activism are pretty much my things, both research-wise and also life-wise. Those are the only two things I can do. I can write well, I can paint, and I organize. Those are my only 3 things. I literally don't do anything else.
How many times have you slept outside?
Okay. Almost like 6 months at a stretch. I went home obviously to live and eat and shower and whatever. I also had school. I was a full-time student while this was happening and had a job. So yeah, it was like for a while. I think there was a 3-month period in like the Melbourne's winter, which I don't know if you like anyone watching knows Melbourne, but it can get pretty disgustingly cold and wet. It rains the whole time. So sleeping out in the wet cold is a bit of a vibe. But, there were other people. I was not doing it by myself.
What was the biggest success rate any protest you participated in has achieved?
Oh, I mean, this was pretty successful. So 2 of my big ones have been, it also depends on how you define success of a protest movement. I mean, do you mean all your demands were met?
No, of course
Or do you mean it had a lot of people came and it was a good...
Whatever you measure as a success.
Yeah, okay.
So according to your own measure.
So for me, 2 different things. It depends on what kind of movement it is. Like if it is a student union movement, then you assume success if your demands are met. Because it's a pretty protected institution because student unions are functioning inside a university. It's very protected that way. I was the women's officer at my students' union in Melbourne. And we got the university to commit.
What school in Melbourne?
The University of Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
It's like the top school in the country for culture and media.
Oh, okay.
And so when I was a women's officer, I got the University of Melbourne to commit to a standalone sexual misconduct policy, which it didn't have before that, which is kind of strange. But basically what happened is like a very high-profile case of sexual assault happened. And we got Bloomberg Foundation, who actually funded the professors, the perpetrators' research to pull the funding. And we had to contact Bloomberg in the US, which is very impressive because they hadn't ever heard of us. We were a powerful union in Australia, but like in America, why would anyone know about us? And we got that happening. We also got the university to then commit to all of these promises they had been making for like 5 to 10 years before that, saying we will do this, we will have a streamlined reporting process, and they had just never done it. So we got them to do it. We wrote the entire policy. Like we consulted with like other unions, like the teaching union, a bunch of other organizations, the lawyers, etc. And then we got the policy done. That was like, we organized rallies for months during COVID. Then we went in and out of lockdowns. It was bizarre. It was an unhinged time, but we got it done. And like that's pretty successful, I think. That's getting the biggest university in the country, like sitting on thousands of billions of dollars, literally, like actually commit to a policy and write it in a 3-month period. I think that's
a huge success.
That's pretty big success.
That's a big success.
Yeah, and kind of the more community-oriented one, which is very different success, right? Because a community-oriented one, you cannot define success by having your demands met. One, because no one ever agrees on all the demands, because it's like out there.
And it has a lot of people. Political implications.
Yeah, and it is you get the actual government to agree to you, which is very different from like the university. Also because you could be harmed seriously in the streets, whereas like in the same way.
Do you think of that?
Yeah, you have to, and especially if I'm not an Australian citizen. Like it had a very different implication because I could get deported if I got caught in the wrong thing. So the good thing to do that is that there's a lot of education these days on accessible protesting, and having a non-citizen in there made sure that people were thinking about the fact that a lot of people wanting to show up will be immigrants. So to have roles that are accessible to other people. Like, for example, the only people important to a protest are not the people who are sleeping out. There are also people who bring those people food. There are also people who are contacting the media and like giving the media quotes, because blowing a protest movement out of proportion is very much like the media's like real thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of good independent media organizations look for people to do press. A lot of them are looking for quotes. We try to make sure that the attention is not on the protesters and on the actual cause that we're protesting, because the Sleep Out protest was about refugees. They were being locked basically in plain sight in some hotel on a street, and no one knew they were refugees because they were in a hotel. But they basically couldn't leave even their own corridor.
They're on stage.
Yeah, and like they were basically held hostage in a hotel for a while. But the hotel is empty now. Like they all got cleared out. All of them got repatriation visas in the country. I mean, Australia still does a bad thing where they keep them on bridging visas, so those people cannot be enrolled at a university or have jobs. But they at least have houses, and they can get more like casual work, like forklift driving or like work at a market or something. So they have lives, which is better than.
Have you been in a protest, or have you heard of a protest where the protesters are targeted, like if you are a migrant?
Yes.
And then they might
or if you're a person of color.
I mean,
if you're a person of color and you're in a protest movement, the police will target you because you're a person of color. This has happened to me several times. And Australia has a weird thing about racism where they don't really confront it because it's so multicultural. They just pretend there is no longer any racism, which is like really bad. And a lot of Aboriginal people in Australia, so-called Australia, are like doing a lot of really good work in like getting people educated, and there's a lot of like sort of immigrant Aboriginal solidarity around that, which have really interestingly been brought up through protest movements. You don't have these conversations. Like you can have them in academia, but they're not productive. They're not thinking about the practical in academia. Protest movements are. And so there are people in the movement space that are not in arrestable roles, and then there are people so when you're trying to organize, you don't just start taking your sleeping bag and sleeping out somewhere. There's a lot of planning there.
There's a lot of planning. There's a lot of stakeholders.
Yeah, you have to like contact the city council because you're technically infringing. That's their road. They were like, and like they used to do that even when they gave us permission when we used to sleep out. The city council would keep sending their like the car with the brooms attached to them to like clean the streets as soon as we would go there to sleep.
Does the police keep safety? Do they kind of?
Our safety, no.
The police oppose?
Yeah, of course, they oppose. They would show up and they would like try to tell like, oh, we're here to protect you, but the police are not there to protect you. They're obviously not. They're not showing up with a horse trying to stamp you into getting out of there to protect you. That's not how that works. The police are not your allies. But yeah, there are non-arrestable roles. So when you're planning a movement, you would like raise your hand up and like ask people like who's comfortable being in an arrestable position and who's not. In fact, it's very common in climate movements because some of them, are, if you're like locking yourself to the gate or something, or you're like gluing yourself to the street, which are common climate tactics. Yeah. Those are arrestable positions. Those people will get arrested. So that's the tactic there. They're trying to get arrested. So before the movement starts,
they already have a plan.
People know who's going to be in an arrestable position and who's not. So there are some people who like are liaisons, people who are working on the media behind, people who are bringing people food, first aid, which are like very important roles in a movement that are not usually like more prone to arrest. So you do think about those things.
You have vast experience regarding social movements.
Yes, I do. I do. I've been doing this for like 12, 13 years now. So it's been a while. Like it's more than.
So what's the motivation? Motivation, is it more like the cause you agree with? Are there protests, or you're just excited to join for change? What
No, I've never been. All activism is related if it's done well. Everyone's impressions are tied. So chances are, if you're, like, for example, fighting for refugee rights, you would be showing up for, like, police brutality or any protest against police brutality, protests about Palestine, because you know that oppression is tied. So chances are you're someone who believes that everyone should be, like, free and, like, there should not be any police brutality, settler colonialism, etc. So chances are usually similar people show up to those things because, if you believe in one of those things, you are likely to believe in the other one. But if you're a full-time organizer, as in this is the work you do, then you kind of save energy for the movement that is the closest to your heart. And you show up to the rallies of the other movements because they're connected, but you're not going to take up an organizing role in all of them because then you will tire out and you will never do anything correctly. So lots of people are like climate organizers, but they obviously go to other rallies because they believe that everyone should be equal or whatever, but they don't necessarily take an organizing role in them. I've done a lot of refugee rights, a lot of immigration justice related rallies, or student rights. So I've taken an organizing role in those situations. But I've shown up to climate rallies because I care about the climate. But I wouldn't take up an organizing role because I'm doing something else. So there are so many people in the world, everyone gets involved with a cause that is very close to their heart. And also you want to listen to the community that's organizing the thing the most closely. You don't show up to anti-racism protest and like speak over people of color or the people who are at the front lines of racial injustice.
Yeah.
So it's that. Like you show up to causes you believe in and you can show up to as many of them.
Let's capture this argument or this discussion to rather focus on protesting or participating in social movement as an immigrant, you know?
Yes.
It's an interesting area because people can be subconsciously okay, I'm not from here. You know, I don't know the social norms or this or that.
Of course.
When people are conscious of that, how can you encourage them to engage in social movement? It's there to their heart. They want to do it. There's some rally going up in Chicago about some topic that I'm interested in. But I know I'm not an American citizen.
Yeah.
And because of that consciousness, I watch from afar. I mean, what would be your advice to I mean, how will you react to that?
I mean, my experience from this is mostly from living in Australia, but I've been to a couple of rallies in Chicago. So I think one good way to is like research who's organizing it, like some groups who's organizing it, because there's usually an event. So there's always like, for example, a lot of the Palestine rallies in Chicago are hosted by Students for Justice Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. And they're pretty much like the big, like because they're bigger bodies. And I'm not saying that there's ever a guarantee that something won't go wrong. So there's always like make sure you know where your boundaries are. If you're a disabled person, because I'm also chronically disabled, like I have mobility disorders, I make sure I always have enough water, medication, and a prescription in my bag. Make sure you never have drugs in your bag, even if it's weed, although it's legal. Like, it just clouds police judgment. Like, there are all sorts of different considerations to make. But the first step, I think, as an immigrant is to, like, see who is organizing it. Because some bodies of, like, some organizations are a lot more policed than others. Some are just a lot friendlier because they're more accessible. Like, if it's a family-friendly protest, because, like, there are parents and kids who are going to show up, those are more likely to be friendlier. Also, like, even if I'm not encouraging people to, like, get involved in anything dangerous. So, like, the big part is do your research. But also, like, some of the times that I have been too scared to show up, I've just not shown up, and I've chosen to do something different, like get food for the people who attended the protest. Or make sure that one big non-arrestable rule that I forgot to mention was to, like, if people have been arrested, to go pick them up with fresh clothes. It's like a big rule. Like if people get tear gassed or whatever at a protest,
and you find a way to.
Some people, like, you go there after, or you let people come to your house, bring them a change of clothes, make sure they're fine. Like, those are great roles that never come under the radar of, like, the protest. You're not actually going up, bringing people food and
the
making
logistics
sure. These are great opportunities to get involved. Like, one of my first roles at a protest ever was I did medical stuff for the Black Lives Matter rally in Melbourne. Because I know that a lot of people in the US were getting deported, like international students. So, like, my partner who went to school in Minneapolis and was obviously in a very stressful situation as an international student, very much told me to be super careful, although I was in Melbourne, which is a lot friendlier. Like, Melbourne is more chill than the US, by the way.
In the US, some persons will be campaigning for you to be deported.
Yeah, exactly. You know? Like,
when you whatever movement is
very different. Yeah, it's very different. And my partner was, like, really scared, and he was like, please don't go. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to walk the rally. I'm just going to be a medic. So I was just doing first aid. I'm a qualified first aider. It was also, like, there are lots of free mental health first aid and, like, general first aid trainings that are available for free. So if you want to get involved, get one of those trainings done, or, like, there are community workshops, or there are, like, hospitals run free trainings all the time as well. If you can get in touch with, like, a community one, do that, and then you can always sign up. There's always some sort of medical first aid. People can hand out water bottles at rallies. You can just stand there with a carton of bottles if you have a car. Stand near the protest and hand people water bottles. There are so many different ways to get involved with organizing that have nothing to do with, like, sort of the clashes that are very, like, out there, blown out of proportion in the media. When we visualize protests, we think about all these, like, people clashing and the cops beating you up. And that does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. But I'm saying is that is the way that the state discourages you from getting involved, because that's, like, your fear is always the worst thing that can happen to you. No one is scared of the very mediocre. Like, I'm not scared that, I'm going to lose my bottle. I am scared that I'm going to get deported. It's always an extreme that you are scared about.
It's always the extreme.
Yeah, nobody has any mediocre fears.
I'm also scared I'm going to be shot, you know?
Yeah. This is an extremely valid. As people of color, like, this is a very real fear. I also have that fear about going to the grocery store, for that matter. This is not just a fear of going to a protest.
You know, I met someone and the person had this pepper spray. I'm like, I thought that hair is safe. You say, you never know.